Hey everyone, What If Fan here, bringing you another exciting part of What If Transmigrated in Bleach World. You can find the fanfic title and the original author's name on my Patreon page. Make sure to check it out and show them some love. If you enjoy the video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Also check out my Patreon channel for early releases of all the series, where you can find all the series released one day ahead of YouTube. Alright, let's jump into it. Chapter 166. Even Kochiki Byakuya, renowned for his speed, wouldn't be able to react in time when facing Tensa Zangetsu. However, Ichigo was certain that even if he activated both his Bankai and Hollowification, his speed and slashing power couldn't match Shiroa's casual attack. In terms of speed, he couldn't keep up with his opponent's movements at all. He couldn't even see them clearly. In fact, no one present could see Uehara Shiroa's movements clearly. Shiroa's speed was so fast that it seemed to transcend time, as if he existed in a different dimension. In the time it took them to launch one attack, he could launch 10, as if he could stretch 1 second into 10. The power behind his slashes was incomprehensible. Ichigo's Tensa Zangetsu after Bankai couldn't hurt Neutra at all. The title of the strongest hero among the Arankars wasn't a boast, it was reality. Yet Shiroa had used only a branch to easily cut off Neutra's arm, treating the strongest hero as nothing. This went beyond being merely powerful. It wasn't a matter of capability, but something entirely incomprehensible and unimaginable. It was as if they existed in one world, and Shiroa in another. That's why Shiroa could use a mere branch to accomplish what Tensa Zangetsu could not. In this man's hands, even a branch would become an indestructible sword. This was the commander of the T-gun, Uehara Shiroa. At this moment, Ichigo remembered the man with slick back hair and glasses who had killed a captain with ease and held his Zanpakuto with just one hand. Perhaps only Aizen, who had fooled all the captains, could do such a thing. At the same time, in the Palace of Night, the Aizen trio used special instruments to witness Uehara Shiroa's amazing swordplay. Aizen admitted he couldn't replicate this feat. In truth, Aizen didn't fully understand this technique. He could only guess that Uehara Shiroa had used some special means. Of course, this was only part of Uehara Shiroa's secret. The opponent's strength now revealed just the tip of the iceberg. Although the revealed part was already strong, it remained insignificant compared to the massive iceberg hidden beneath the surface. Aizen felt his previous strategy was correct. He should avoid direct confrontation with Uehara Shiroa. Once the Hogyoku was fully fused, he would uncover Uehara Shiroa's secrets. Of course, by then, whatever secrets his opponent possessed might not matter. After all, the power of transcendence was absolute. Jin wiped non-existent cold sweat from his forehead and exclaimed, "Lord Aizen, this isn't right. I never expected Neutra would be so vulnerable. If we continue to let Uehara Shiroa act freely, won't all the chess pieces we've worked so hard to acquire be destroyed?" Of course, he didn't actually care about the life or death of these Arankar. He also didn't care why Uehara Shiroa was so strong. In fact, he felt somewhat numb to it all. Regardless of reason, this old classmate could do things they couldn't do or even imagine, just like Aizen on his throne. They were geniuses, while people like Aizen and Uehara Shiroa were monsters. Jin had learned to reconcile with himself on this point. But he would never reconcile with Aizen, let alone forgive him for what he had done. So he cared deeply about Aizen's next plan. Tozen Kanem nodded in agreement. Although these Arankar aren't allies of justice, we still need them as a fighting force for now. His reaction mirrored Jin's. Both were somewhat numb with shock. He had abandoned any notion of dealing with Uehara Shiroa completely. He now recognized how unrealistic such an idea was. He hadn't accomplished it before, and it was impossible now. Their opponent wielded a time-space type Zanpakuto, making him invincible at any time and place. Tozen now only hoped Uehara Shiroa wouldn't interfere with their plan. As long as their plan succeeded in Lord Aizen fused with the complete Hogyoku, even time-space abilities would become insignificant. "It's fine, Jin," Aizen said, watching Uehara Shiroa on the screen with interest. "We have as many fighters like Neutra as we need. As long as chess pieces serve their purpose, it doesn't matter if they're all sacrificed." Containing Uehara Shiroha without paying any price is impossible. That said, he knew in his heart that Neutra had served no purpose as a chess piece. Just like his opponent's strength, Neutra's impending death was meaningless, irrelevant to the bigger picture, and insignificant. He had simply encountered an opponent he shouldn't have faced. However, this had been part of Aizen's plan all along. As long as Uehara Shiroha was satisfied, losing a few chess pieces wasn't a big deal, it might even be beneficial. Could it be that even the Espadas have no way to deal with my old classmate? Jin pushed slightly harder. His attempt was somewhat bold and obvious. But at this point, using more force didn't matter. After all, it was almost time to see the truth. Besides, being bold occasionally was more deceptive than constant caution. Uehara Shiroha is no ordinary Shinigami, Aizen replied calmly, studying Jin. Jin was a genius in every aspect. But even such a genius paled in comparison to Uehara Shiroha, the two weren't even comparable. In the Palace of Night, hearing Aizen's praise, Jin remained silent. Shiroha's strength was obvious to anyone not blind. His question had merely been to gauge Aizen's attitude and test his trump card. Tozen seemed unconvinced. He just relies on his Zanpakuto ability. He cannot be compared to Lord Aizen. In his eyes, Aizen was the only light, the ultimate god. How could a mortal compare to a god? No, you're wrong, Aizen explained patiently. Among Shinigami, none should surpass Uehara Shiroha. He is perhaps the most perfect Shinigami. Whether in Zanjutsu, Hakuda, Kido, Ryatsu, physical strength, or even Zanpakuto ability, Uehara Shiroha is incomparably powerful. His abilities and talents exceed the limits of common sense. Therefore, we cannot view Uehara Shiroha through ordinary standards and boundaries. He effortlessly reaches limits that other Shinigami can barely approach, and he doesn't even possess the weaknesses that Shinigami typically have. This is Uehara Shiroha, a Shinigami that defies common sense. In truth, Aizen had initially hesitated to use the word perfect. Because perfection in others' eyes, in his opinion, merely reached the limit of their perception. Ultimately, it revealed a lack of ability and vision. For instance, Aizen himself had surpassed what ordinary Shinigami considered perfect in all aspects. The vision of these mediocre souls was too limited. What they deemed perfect was merely a reflection in a mirror. Aizen refused to be as shallow and ignorant as them. He would only surpass the so-called perfection. But Uehara Shiroha was so exceptional that even he could only describe him as perfect. Such talent and strength made him feel inferior and even overturned his perceptions. At first, Aizen hadn't considered himself a Shinigami. His talent was too extraordinary, he existed in two dimensions compared to others. His growth rate and potential completely transcended ordinary Shinigami, truly monstrous and unimaginable. Thus, Aizen had learned to disguise himself and separate himself from other Shinigami. He had experienced the isolation of "it's lonely at the top" very early on. Until he confirmed the abilities and talent of Uehara Shiroha. Only then did Aizen admit that he was, indeed, just a Shinigami. Some peaks truly couldn't be climbed without the Hogyoku's help. But this made everything more challenging and interesting. Regarding this, Tozen remained silent. He felt that Uehara Shiroha was still just a Shinigami after all, with a slightly stronger Zanpakuto. Though he couldn't see with his eyes, his heart remained clear as a mirror. But since Aizen had spoken, he too wanted to discover what made Uehara Shiroha so extraordinary. In the desert, Neutra actually had a similar opinion. He believed Shiroha's slash was so powerful because of his Zanpakuto's abilities. But regardless, a Shinigami was still a Shinigami, they would die if struck properly. And he was an Arrancar, the fifth Espada, a great hollow with the power of resurrection and high-speed regeneration. Even missing arms and legs couldn't stop him from killing his enemy. Now it was time to show his true power. He gritted his teeth and unleashed all his Ryatsu. The powerful spiritual pressure exploded outward, blowing away the surrounding sand. Simultaneously, Reisher in the air gathered and swirled around Neutra, forming hurricanes. The sudden sandstorm and terrifying pressure made Orihime Inoue, Ichigo Kurosaki, and Neliel behind the rock tremble. They raised their arms to shield themselves from the sandstorm. Only Shiroa remained motionless, like a deep abyss or immovable mountain, exuding an unshakable presence. He didn't take Neutra seriously at all, letting him do as he pleased. Neutra in his normal state was too vulnerable to a single blow, and there was no value in killing him. Neutra at full strength might barely serve as a whetstone. It was just enough for Shiroa to hone his Ryatsu and gain some insignificant combat experience. In the eyes of both Aizen and Uehara Shiroa, Neutra was merely an insignificant pawn. This Arrancar who claimed to be the strongest among the Espada was just a chess piece in the greater scheme, and an unimportant one at that. In fact, all the Espada were unimportant chess pieces. Aizen's Espada forces were more of a smokescreen, just like during Rukia's execution in Soul Society. These were just means of diverting attention. In the end, Aizen would still need to take action himself. Pray, Santa Teresa. With a roar, Neutra completed his resurrection and unleashed Santa Teresa. His form changed dramatically. In the wind and sand, a huge and strange figure slowly emerged. First came crescent-shaped horns that gathered powerful Ryatsu. The two horns on Neutra's head bent vertically upwards. They didn't look like weapons for attack, but more like decorations. At the same time, his white eye patch fell away. This was originally where his hollow hole should have been. Now, the black hollow that should have been empty contained a long, narrow eye with a ferocious look. Cross-shaped yellow facial patterns decorated his face. Of course, the most terrifying change was to his arms. After his resurrection, his severed arm returned to normal, and he even grew 4 more arms. Though Neutra didn't have 3 heads, he now possessed 6 arms. Each arm held a massive double-edged scythe, creating an oppressive and terrifying sight. Oraheim, who was treating Ichigo, trembled. The Ryatsu gathering over there, it's truly terrible. His Ryatsu has become stronger, and even his arm has regenerated. What's happening? Ichigo's eyes widened in confusion. This was the second time he had witnessed an Arrancar's released form, their so-called resurrection. Last time, Grimmjow had initiated his resurrection without any explanation. And just like Zanpakuto, different hollows gained different abilities after resurrection. Therefore, Ichigo had no idea what new powers Neutra possessed after his transformation. For Arrancars, resurrection fused with their sealed hollow core. This enhanced their Ryatsu, healed injuries, and awakened special abilities. For example, Neutra now possessed high-speed regeneration because of his resurrection. Simultaneously, the power of Santa Teresa had reached its peak. Neutra felt full of confidence in this form, just as he cared deeply about his ranking among the Espada and took pride in his identity. He shouted, "Shinigami, you can never kill me. You can never kill me. It's absolutely impossible. Now I don't fear injury. No matter how you slash at me, you'll definitely be the one who dies in the end." After resurrection, Neutra's Ryatsu increased dramatically, far exceeding that of ordinary Shinigami captains. In the original timeline, it was Kenpachi Zaraki who faced Neutra after his resurrection. Even Kenpachi, with his immense Ryatsu, acknowledged that Neutra's spiritual pressure was impressive at a level where he needed to fight seriously. So the captain of the 11th Division, who loved a challenge, recalled the time when Captain Commander Yamamoto Genryosei Shigakuni taught him kendo. In truth, that teaching itself had been a trap. Yamamoto deliberately used a teaching method that Kenpachi disliked, limiting his strength and denying him the opportunity to properly learn kendo. This was an order from the Central 46. After all, Kenpachi wasn't professionally trained, didn't obey the law, and lacked discipline. In their view, allowing such a beast to learn kendo and gain greater power was dangerous. The nobles of the Soul Society were only capable of such short-sighted thinking. In short, Yamamoto's teaching was very successful. The strongest Shinigami only taught Kenpachi one move repeatedly, to hold his sword with both hands. Because a Shinigami's wrists are the output points of Ryatsu, the power of holding a sword with both hands was incomparable to holding it with just one. This efficiency wasn't as simple as 1 + 1, it increased the power several times over. For other Shinigami, holding a sword with both hands to enhance slashing power was common sense and an entry-level skill. Except for top-tier fighters like Aizen and Uehara Shiroa, almost all Shinigami fought by holding their swords with both hands, including Ichigo, with his full attack coefficient. Other Shinigami wanted to become as strong as possible, but Kenpachi's situation was unique. He actually didn't want to become too powerful, otherwise, battles would become boring. Moreover, the Captain Commander's teaching method was extremely tedious. Chapter 167. Kenpachi Zaraki had given up learning kendo that day and forgotten the technique of holding a sword with both hands. It wasn't until he encountered Neutra after returning to battle and felt his opponent's amazing Ryatsu that he remembered the two-handed technique again. With that memory restored, he defeated Neutra with a single strike. Forcing Kenpachi to wield his sword with both hands had been the limit of Neutra's accomplishment. But Neutra, oblivious to this fact, couldn't accept he was so weak. He possessed 6 arms and 6 weapons, while Uehara Shiroa had only 2 arms and 1 sword. In Neutra's mind, the math was simple: even if Shiroa cut off one of his hands, he could still slice his opponent to pieces with the remaining 5. 6 is greater than 1. Simple math. How could he possibly lose? Neutra roared, swinging his 6 arms and dancing his 6 black sickles in a furious assault against Uehara Shiroa. The massive black sickles formed a deadly tornado that completely surrounded Shiroha. Watching this scene unfold, Ichigo, Orihime, and Nilil all gasped in shock. Neutra laughed wildly with smug satisfaction. "This is the power of my resurrection. It's over. I've won." He was certain that his Santa Teresa had struck his enemy with devastating force. He was, after all, the strongest of the Espada. When the dust cleared, Uehara Shiroa stood unharmed without even a speck of dust on his clothes. "So this is your resurrection?" Shiroha said calmly. "This is your strongest attack? Is that all you've got? You Arankars really need to strengthen your Zanpakuto and offensive capabilities. Weren't you bragging about your power earlier? And this is what you call your best?" The 6 sickles of Santa Teresa had indeed struck at Uehara Shiroa, but they hadn't even managed to stain his clothes, let alone hurt him. The blades were firmly blocked by Shiroha's perfect universal barrier before they could touch even a thread of his clothing. His S-level ability that was approaching perfection wasn't something a mere Neutra could handle, especially not with a resurrection. Witnessing this incredible scene, Orihime, Ichigo, and Nilil stood stunned. Their eyes widened as their thoughts froze in disbelief. As for Neutra himself, when his arm had been cut off earlier, his mind had gone blank. Now, he experienced that same tranquility again. The world fell silent around him, leaving only a peaceful pure white before his eyes. The noise and rage that had consumed his heart vanished entirely. In this moment, Neutra found the peace he had secretly longed for. Simply put, he was beaten into stunned silence. Someone had broken through his defenses with a casual attack faster than lightning. His most prized and powerful defense had proven utterly inferior. It was outrageous to the extreme. In front of Shiroa, his supposedly strongest hero was nothing but a joke. First it was Aizen, and now Uehara Shiroa. These Shinigami were becoming more outrageous than the last. So they weren't even pretending anymore, right? The speed, defense, and attack power of the Shinigami far exceeded his own. So what was the point of Hollows and Arankars even existing? Where was the justice? It was completely unfair. His dignity had been deeply wounded. In Las Noches, Aizen, Tozen, and Jin also witnessed this shocking scene. A heavy silence fell over them. After a long pause, Jin asked in confusion, how did he do that? A Shinigami's defense isn't supposed to be that strong. From what they'd observed, it seemed more like Uehara Shiroa possessed the strongest hero, while Neutra fought with the vulnerability of a Shinigami. This couldn't be explained by simple Ryatsu defense or Zanpakuto abilities. Even the knowledgeable and cunning Jin found it incredible. Every time he thought he'd grown accustomed to being shocked, his old classmate would reveal new tricks that challenged his understanding of the world. Tozen nodded and said in a muffled voice, "I see. This is what a perfect Shinigami looks like." Uehara Shiroa's offensive and defensive capabilities were incomparable to ordinary Shinigami, and even top-level Arankars couldn't match him. This truly defied common sense. Before, Tozen had thought Aizen overestimated Uehara Shiroha, but now he realized he'd actually underestimated him. Now comes the critical moment, Aizen said, a strange light flashing in his eyes. Shiroha's performance had indeed exceeded his expectations yet again. Facing such an unfathomable opponent, Aizen wouldn't act rashly. He would observe patiently. But simultaneously, he would prepare for all possible scenarios. Shiroha's next actions would determine which tactics Aizen would employ. Just as Neutra was reeling from the shock that his full-strength attack had been completely ineffective, Uehara Shiroha launched another assault. His attack was remarkably simple, so simple it could hardly be called an attack. He merely waved the branch in his hand, letting it fall lightly through the air. Because he used only a branch and didn't release any Ryatsu, the attack appeared completely harmless, lacking both power and speed. On the surface, even an ordinary person could have blocked such a casual strike. Seeing this seemingly dismissive attack, Neutra's fury rekindled as he roared, "How dare you look down on me like this? How could such a pathetic attack possibly hurt me? I am Neutra of the Five Crescents, the strongest of the Espada." Though this inconspicuous branch had already severed one of his arms, Neutra refused to accept reality. What happened before was then, and this was now. His Ryatsu had increased dramatically, and with 6 arms and 6 weapons, he believed he could fight and resist. Even if he couldn't defend, he could block, and if he couldn't block, he could regenerate his arms. Now that he'd activated his Resurrection, surely he couldn't be defeated by a mere branch, right? "I'm going to fight you, strongest," Shiroha said, completely disdainful of the self-proclaimed mightiest Espada. The more someone lacks something, the louder they proclaim to have it. Neutra shouted that he was the strongest, but deep down, he knew better than anyone that he was weak. Several Arankars appeared very arrogant, but behind their arrogance lay a profound inferiority complex. This was the sorrow of the weak. Although the Espada had been enhanced by the Hogyoku in terms of raw power and had achieved some level of strength, their spirits remained weak. Every Arankar carried a corresponding mental defect, just like the hollow still residing within them. This was the original sin of being a hollow. Simply put, these beings were all giant babies. The truly strong aren't just powerful in physical might, but also possess an indestructible spirit. In terms of spiritual fortitude, these Espada were far inferior. However, Uehara Shiroha had no interest in this psychological assessment, nor did he care. He wasn't a psychologist, so their emotional sensitivity or humanity meant nothing to him. He just needed to kill them. As his thoughts shifted, the branch in Uehara Shiroha's hand erupted into dazzling light. The radiance was so intense it eclipsed the cold moon hanging in the sky. Powerful Ryatsu gathered around him, causing the very spirits in the atmosphere to tremble. Wherever the light touched, everything was annihilated. There was no hurricane, no shockwave, only a terrifying power capable of cutting through space itself. Neutra's pupils shrank as his heart pounded in panic. Not good, I must defend immediately. In that moment, the ordinary branch appeared infinitely large before his eyes, carrying a might that could destroy worlds. Before this overwhelming force that rivaled the ocean's power, his figure and Ryatsu seemed utterly insignificant. He frantically waved his 6 sickles, crossing them in front of him as a shield. Neutra's reaction was impressively fast, but it proved useless against the simple branch that pierced through heaven and earth. With just one blow, the branch cut through his weapons, his arms, his body, and his very soul. His Ryatsu and Hiero, even after activating Resurrection, didn't last even a second. It was as if they never existed at all. Uehara Shiroha had crushed Neutra's body, soul, and dignity with nothing more than a branch. Neutra didn't even realize he'd been defeated. He simply felt himself enveloped by light before his body shattered into pieces. Nearby, Ichigo and Oroheim trembled in confusion. They'd only registered a flash of light and felt an overwhelmingly terrifying Ryatsu. When the light faded, the arrogant Neutra lay on the ground like a broken doll. Most of his supposedly indestructible body had melted like a wax figure left in the sun. His Ryatsu and breath had grown desperately weak. This was beyond their comprehension. A warrior who had suppressed Bankai-wielding Ichigo was utterly defenseless before Uehara Shiroa, like an ant, unable to withstand even a single strike. What kind of power was this? How is this possible? Neutra stared at his broken body with disbelief etched across his face. Why can't my body recover? What kind of ability is this? Even now, he thought Uehara Shiroa had used the same trick as Neliel's Gamuza. He absolutely couldn't believe or accept that someone could defeat him after Resurrection with such a casual blow. Yet the pain in his body was unmistakable, and the draining of his vitality and Ryatsu continued unabated. All of this confirmed the harsh reality. The enemy's Ryatsu was too overwhelming. Even its residual power limited his regenerative abilities. In other words, he was dying. His life was already in countdown. Neutra wasn't afraid of death, nor of dying in battle. He even felt that being killed by a truly strong opponent would bring relief and honor. However, no matter how he lied to himself, he couldn't accept dying like an ant being casually stepped on. This was complete failure. Just as Neliel had said, he wasn't a warrior, just a bug. This realization destroyed everything about him. The pain was too intense. So real, so excruciating, so desperate. But this was reality. This emptiness, pain, and despair were even more real than Hueco Mundo itself. Looking down at the fallen Neutra, Uehara Shiroa spoke lightly. It seems my training isn't complete yet, my strength was a bit too excessive. Don't worry, I deliberately avoided your vital. You shouldn't die too quickly. After speaking, he activated his perfect level observation haki, using his ability to see through everything to examine Neutra's Resurrection form. The Visored and Arankar were both Aizen's explorations and attempts at transcendent power. Although in Uehara Shiroa's view, these attempts weren't merely full of flaws, they were fundamentally wrong from the root. Nevertheless, the Arankar's Resurrection and power composition still held certain reference value. This was probably Neutra's only remaining worth. Just then, Nell jumped out from hiding and declared loudly, Lord Uehara is invincible. The espada with the strongest he arrow is so weak. Neutra's Ryatsu had been permeating the area, forcing her to hide until now. For reasons she couldn't explain, she felt intensely afraid of Neutra's Ryatsu. Despite being an Arankar herself, supposedly on the same side, Neutra's spiritual pressure made her feel uneasy, fearful, and even disgusted. Yet Uehara Shiroa's Ryatsu gave her a sense of security. Now that Shiroa's spiritual pressure filled the area, Nell felt safe enough to emerge from behind the rocks. Is that you, Nell? Looking at the proud Nell, Ichigo finally made the connection and continued, Where have you been all this time? Pash and the others have been looking for you. Though Ichigo was somewhat faceblind, Nell's features were too distinctive to mistake. They had been separated from Nell when that strange hollow created a sandstorm. Pash and the others thought Nell had been taken to Las Noches, but they hadn't expected to find her here. Besides, wasn't Nell a hollow? Why was she traveling with Uehara Shiroa from the Shinigami faction? Nell blinked her large brown eyes and sneered, Stupid Shinigami, you're the ones who got lost. Nell never gets lost. But then she noticed Neutra's broken body on the ground and the confused look in his eyes. She instinctively shrank back, moving behind Uehara Shiroa for protection. Watching Nell hide skillfully behind Shiroa, Neutra grew even more confused and asked, Those markings and that mask, there's no mistaking it. Are you Neliel? Seeing Neliel in this childlike state disturbed him deeply. Previously, this woman had been in Las Noches as one of the top 3 Espada, ranking quite high among the 10. He had challenged her repeatedly without fear, only to fail each time. Back then, Neutra had recognized her strength and asked Neliel to kill him. He felt he deserved death and that it would be a mark of respect. However, this woman had not only refused to kill him but had mocked him, calling him a bug unworthy of dying by her hand. Even when Neutra had resorted to sneak attacks that seriously injured her, she had never yielded her contempt for him. But now, this once proud and disdainful woman cowered behind another man for protection. It was like watching someone else effortlessly ride a bicycle he could never reach, no matter how hard he tried. Yet Shiroa had proven with absolute strength that Neutra was indeed weak, an ant, as insignificant as a bug. Neutra's defenses crumbled once more. All he had ever wanted was the respect matching his status and the glory he deserved after battle. Was that so difficult? Yes, this is Neliel, Uehara Shiroa said disdainfully. Don't act like a victim. You simply can't handle losing. Chapter 168. It's not without reason that Neliel looked down on you, Uehara Shiroa continued. You're just a piece of trash, good for nothing. In his opinion, Neutra was reckless, childish, and couldn't handle defeat. He had no intention of speaking up for Neliel, he simply looked down on Neutra. The man was too despicable. In terms of both strength and character, Neutra was completely outclassed. Before Uehara Shiroa, the so-called strongest hero was nothing but an ant. Lying against a broken rock pillar in his final moments, Neutra sneered. Shinigami, you're no different from us. You're just as cruel and cold-blooded. There's no justice or faith in your heart at all. He thought of Tozen, the blind Shinigami. That man always preached about justice and duty while looking down on the Arrancar. Now it seemed that was all a joke. The facts proved that Shinigami were killers just like them. Uehara Shiroa responded with indifference. You're wrong. I'm more cruel and cold-blooded than you. I never forgive. Anyone who offends me or stands in my way will be torn to pieces. This is my justice. This is my belief. And Arrancar overthinking these things was almost amusing. In the extraordinary world, absolute strength was the only thing that mattered, it was everything. Uehara Shiroa didn't care about anything else, including the duties of the Shinigami or the survival of the three realms. Yet these Arrancar seemed fixated on such concerns. This was the fundamental issue with Arrancar and high-level hollows. The hollows of Hueco Mundo relied on killing and hunting to gain the right to evolve and survive. Hunting and killing were instincts engraved in their very souls. However, after becoming Arrancar, those instincts were sealed into their Zanpakuto. They gained more humanity, along with more thoughts and doubts. But a beast that once roared and hunted in the jungle loses its wildness once locked in a zoo. And a sword in its scabbard cannot draw blood. Becoming more human-like wasn't necessarily a good thing, hesitating like Ichigo Kurosaki would only make them weaker. On one hand, they looked down on Shinigami who were bound by rules. On the other, they themselves had gradually taken on the appearance of Shinigami, their true selves bound by their Zanpakuto. They refused to face this truth, unwilling to acknowledge their own transformation, completely lacking self-awareness. Ants were just ants, after all, they didn't even possess the small degree of self-knowledge. As Uehara Shiroa looked at Neutra, his eyes held neither disdain nor anger, only indifference. That gaze was like a god looking down upon all living beings, ruthless and cold. The indifference in his pupils matched his unfathomable strength, inspiring fear from the depths of one's heart. Noticing Uehara Shiroa's eyes that seemed as ancient and unfeeling as millennia of ice, Neutra couldn't help but feel a chill in his core. He drew a ragged breath and said, "You can't win. Aizen and the Espada won't let you go. This is Hueco Mundo. We still have the Hogyoku." He refused to be crushed like a bug. But beyond empty threats, he could do nothing. Before Uehara Shiroa, he was utterly helpless and powerless, all his strength reduced to meaningless words. "You're really stubborn," Uehara Shiroa replied, remaining casual and relaxed despite Neutra's defiance. "Have you ever wondered why Aizen didn't warn you about me? If I'm guessing correctly, you received no information about me at all, not even about the other Shinigami captains. Aizen doesn't lack information, gathering it would be effortless for him. So why didn't he provide any? Because Aizen doesn't treat you Arrancar as people. You were abandoned from the very beginning." As he spoke, his eyes weren't fixed on Neutra but on Las Noches in the distance, more specifically, on the fifth tower where Aizen resided. These words weren't meant for Neutra, but for Aizen, for Neliel, and for Ichigo. This was indeed a war, but not between Hueco Mundo and Siriidii, nor between Shinigami and Arrancar. It was a war between Aizen and the world, between mortals and gods. So that's how it is, Aizen. In his final moments, Neutra no longer cared about such things. None of it mattered anymore. He recalled his first encounter with Uehara Shiroa. Even then, he'd had a premonition that he couldn't defeat him. Perhaps from the beginning, he'd known he had no chance of victory. In that moment, he'd felt an uncontrollable fear. Every pore in his body and his survival instinct had warned him to stay away from this dangerous man. This wasn't a reaction to Ryatsu, it was spiritual oppression, coming from the depths of his soul and primal instincts. Such fear only emerges when lower creatures encounter higher ones. Neutra simply refused to admit he was weak, refused to admit he was afraid, refused to admit that Uehara Shiroa belonged to a higher order of being. So he used anger and aggression to suppress the fear in his heart, believing he had overcome it. However, before absolute power, everything else was meaningless. It turned out that even as an Arrancar, he couldn't change the fact that he was weak. The light in Neutra's eyes gradually dissipated, leaving only emptiness. Witnessing Neutra's death, Orihime felt a pang of reluctance. Even for an enemy, even for an Arrancar, she didn't want to see someone die before her eyes. She had treated enemies with kindness before, returning good for evil. Ichigo was similar. When facing monstrous hollows, he could decisively cut them down. But killing human-shaped Arrancar was truly difficult for him. Of course, Uehara Shiroa's overwhelming strength had opened Ichigo's eyes and made him feel inadequate by comparison. Uehara Shiroa saw through Ichigo's thoughts clearly, but he found them understandable. In essence, Ichigo was just an ordinary person, an honest man, through and through. Though unpleasant to acknowledge, it was true. Throughout several conflicts, Ichigo had played the reluctant hero, always thrust into the role of savior. Whenever crisis threatened the world, everyone thought the same thing: let's go to Karakura town and get Ichigo. Time and again, Ichigo would arrive as scheduled, swinging Zangetsu to slice through whatever threat presented itself. Despite possessing some of the most devastating attack capabilities in the Soul Society, his mind remained fixated solely on protection. Despite his immense strength, he was perpetually treated as a sacrificial lamb. Various powerful entities sought to manipulate Ichigo, eager to harness his power for their own ends. Ichigo's character played a decisive role in making this possible. His weaknesses were too obvious, and there were too many things he couldn't bring himself to abandon, too many things he would sacrifice himself for. These major adversaries never viewed this hero as a true opponent or enemy, merely as a pawn to be played. Of course, in the end, they paid the price when they were shattered one by his Getsuga Tensho. Uehara Shiroa didn't particularly care about Ichigo's mercy. When the time came to act, Ichigo never hesitated. One needed only to look at what happened to Sasuke Aizen and Yawatch in his Soul King form. Moreover, while both Ichigo and Orihime might have pitted Neutra, neither had attempted to stop Shiroa from killing him or tried to save the Espada's life. The two were genuinely grateful to Uehara Shiroa for saving them. This kind of merciful attitude that still recognized practical realities wasn't particularly annoying. Facing the pair who kept bowing in thanks, Uehara Shiroa waved his hand dismissively, then fixed Ichigo with a burning gaze. "You clearly have tremendous power hidden inside you. Why didn't you use it just now? You're still holding back even when your life is at stake. Are you planning to use it in your coffin?" Compared to the spirited warrior who had stormed the Soul Society, Ichigo's performance in Hueco Mundo seemed lackluster. There were multiple reasons for this. On one hand, Ichigo was trying to avoid confronting both this war and the hollow power dwelling within him. He didn't want to face these realities. None of this was what Ichigo had wanted. This revealed that despite his overflowing talent, Ichigo remained immature in virtually every respect: mentally, in fighting spirit, in experience, and so on. On the other hand, the substitute Shinigami badge was limiting him. This item had originally been designed to restrict the first substitute Shinigami, Kugo Jinjo. Although the badge granted its holder legal identity and allowed transformation into Shinigami form, it simultaneously restricted their Ryatsu. More significantly, the badge functioned as a monitoring device, tracking the holder's movements and actions. The Soul Society had deliberately concealed this information from both substitute Shinigami. Jinjo and Ichigo were being monitored without their knowledge. The Soul Society couldn't allow individuals with captain-level spiritual pressure to act freely in the world of the living. Hence, the badge was necessary to track their location and limit their power. The substitute badge appeared to be an identification credential, but in reality, it served as a power limiter and locator. Should circumstances change, the Soul Society could quickly pinpoint the substitute Shinigami's position and either capture or eliminate them. Jinjo had been deceived by this very item. Through the substitute badge, the Tsunoyoshiro family had tracked the first substitute Shinigami's whereabouts and ruthlessly plotted against him. After slaughtering all the Foolbringers, the Tsunoyoshiro family had shifted the blame to Jinjo. The first substitute Shinigami had been betrayed and lost nearly everything, left only with the word despair carved into his experience. Even now, Jinjo continued to evade the Soul Society's pursuit. Like Jinjo before him, Ichigo was constrained by the substitute badge, his Ryatsu weakened. But while this might be a problem for others, it wasn't truly the core issue for Ichigo. If he simply acknowledged himself and embraced his own power, the substitute badge wouldn't be enough to limit his Shinigami abilities. Because he remained conflicted and hesitant, his strength had become unstable, far weaker than when he had invaded the Soul Society. Uehara Shiroa had no interest in the meaningless inner turmoil plaguing Ichigo's heart. He cared only about the young man's strength. He needed Ichigo to adjust his mindset, awaken to his potential, and fulfill his role in eliminating those adversaries that stood in their way. This would allow Shiroa to proceed steadily and comfortably, a true blessing. This was why Uehara Shiroa questioned Ichigo's behavior. Hearing Shiroa's pointed questioning, Ichigo fell silent. If possible, he too wanted to fight at full strength. But this remained an impossible luxury, as the monster in his heart continuously whispered in his ear. Ichigo didn't dare relax for even a moment. Beside him, Orihime also looked uncomfortable. She understood Ichigo's situation. She didn't want Ichigo to use that terrifying power. She simply hoped Ichigo could remain safe, that everyone could remain safe. Of course, this was mere wishful thinking. In the extraordinary world, only power could achieve peace. Everything else was empty talk. Looking at the two silent figures, Uehara Shiroa remained undeterred. He grasped the sword at his waist with his right hand and spoke calmly. "In that case, I'll give you a demonstration. Listen carefully, Ichigo Kurosaki, in this world, power is everything. The reason you're so hesitant and uneasy is simply because your power isn't sufficient. If your power were strong enough, all fear and anxiety would vanish. Watch closely, true power means crushing everything." With those words, he drew Shunkyo and silently activated his Bankai. Under the influence of unlimited blade works, the power of Bankai Shunkyo was elevated to its extreme. Unimaginable Ryatsu, accompanied by brilliant light, bloomed from the cold, snow-white blade of Shunkyo. The majestic spiritual pressure was as vast as the ocean and as heavy as a mountain. The blinding light resembled a supernova explosion, illuminating everything while simultaneously threatening to destroy it all. Under this radiance, ripples appeared in the fabric of time and space. The normally untouchable dimensions of time and space seemed to transform into malleable bubbles that could be manipulated at will. The ripples and light expanded rapidly, first covering the area where the group stood, then spreading to engulf all of Las Noches. Simultaneously, the Garganta was torn open, and 4 passages appeared above Hueco Mundo. And somewhere in the distance, Yurio Ishida and Rukia Kochiki were already hanging by a thread, their lives in imminent danger. Chapter 169. Under the eternal cold moonlight of Hueco Mundo, a brilliant golden energy beam shot skyward, piercing the darkness. After unleashing his Shunkyo Bankai, Uehara Shiroa once again announced his presence to the Espada, Aizen, and all of Hueco Mundo. For a breathtaking moment, the world lost its color. The wind shifted violently as clouds gathered and scattered. The earth beneath trembled and groaned as if in pain. All living things seemed to wail in unison as even the fabric of time and space rippled like disturbed water. The majestic Ryatsu spread outward in waves, forming a terrifying shockwave of such magnitude that even the mightiest of hollows would have been instantly annihilated in its path. The range of this overwhelming spiritual pressure was no longer confined to their immediate surroundings, it began to blanket the entirety of Hueco Mundo, reaching toward its furthest boundaries. The towering column of light ascended to the zenith of the sky, gathering into a radiant golden sun that completely overshadowed the cold, eternal moonlight that typically bathed the realm. Above the endless white desert, this newly formed golden orb hung like the watchful eye of a god, silently observing all of Hueco Mundo with patient, terrible judgment. Standing upon the desert sands, Uehara Shiroa's figure appeared impossibly tall and unyielding, like a mountain that refused to be moved by any force of nature. His posture, his presence, his very aura, like his Ryatsu, instilled an unparalleled sense of oppression and primal fear in all who beheld him. The sensation was not unlike what mortals experience when facing catastrophic natural disasters, a profound mixture of fear, powerlessness, and absolute despair settling into one's heart. Before this monumental wave of spiritual pressure, even Shinigami captains and the Espada themselves were reduced to mere mortals, insignificant before such overwhelming might. Yet, curiously, after the initial fear subsided, an unexpected sense of beauty arose spontaneously within those who witnessed it. This wasn't the conventional beauty of physical form or temperament, but rather the sublime beauty of pure Ryatsu and absolute power. The incomparable spiritual pressure and sense of dominance that overshadowed everything else in existence left everyone dazzled and profoundly shaken to their core. This was the unique beauty brought forth by extraordinary Ryatsu. The stronger the observer, the more deeply they could perceive this beauty, and consequently, the more astonished they became. Just as Orihime, Ichigo, and Nell were experiencing at this very moment. Though Uehara Shiroa's Ryatsu made no direct attack against them, the three still felt its incomparable impact and presence reverberating through their bodies and minds. This was a power capable of destroying not only their physical forms but their very consciousness. The beauty of such surging power made even those who had never craved strength, like Orihime, feel a strange mixture of awe and trembling reverence. Not long ago, Neutra's final venomous words before death had still echoed in their ears, his threats sounding genuinely terrifying. After all, no matter how formidable Uehara Shiroa might be, logic dictated he couldn't possibly stand against Aizen and all 10 Espadas simultaneously, especially on enemy territory. The three had genuinely worried that Shiroa would suffer dire consequences for his boldness. But now, witnessing his majestic figure bathed in brilliant light, Neutra's final threats seemed weak and almost laughably insignificant. In the face of this terrifying Ryatsu, any resistance, any defiance at all, was doomed to futility. All that remained possible was silence and complete submission. Just as now, their minds had gone completely blank, capable only of processing feelings of worship and shock. This wasn't because they themselves were particularly weak, it was because Uehara Shiroa's display of power was simply that overwhelming. The technique Uehara Shiroa had just employed was called Bankai Shunkyo Reishurisan, Spirit Stone Flash Cut. In essence, it was an application of his Bankai's true power. This devastating move combined the abilities of the Mind Gem, Unlimited Blade Works, and Bankai Shunkyo Jikusen into a single, harmonious attack. Under the influence of his EX ability, the power of Reishur was stimulated beyond normal limits, surpassing even the maximum threshold that a Zanpakuto could traditionally reach. With this single sword strike, the Espada were forced to bow, and all of Hueco Mundo shook in response. Ichigo, Orihime, and Nell had only indirectly experienced the impact of Reishi's energy, yet they were already shocked beyond their ability to control their reactions. The Espada and Aizen, who were directly targeted by this display, received an impact so profound that they were momentarily rendered speechless and immobile. The first to suffer its effects were the 7th Espada, Zamari Ruro's Rukia's opponent, and the 8th Espada, Sailaparo Grand's, who had been facing Yuryu. Their proximity to the epicenter of the blast made them particularly vulnerable. Sailaparo had once held the prestigious rank of 0 Espada. Although he had previously been utterly overwhelmed by Uehara Shiroa, his fundamental power remained substantial. So after the initial shock passed, he quickly regained his composure and fled toward the ground, seeking shelter from the onslaught of spiritual pressure. He had no choice but to flee. Though the sudden eruption of power carried no specific killing intent, it simply expanded outward in all directions. The Ryatsu it contained seemed to transcend normal limitations of time and space, acting directly upon the soul and mind of anyone caught within its range. Sailaparo once again experienced the excruciating sensation of his very soul being torn asunder. This was only the second time in his existence that he had been so thoroughly and brutally humbled. Even Aizen had never subjected him to such overwhelming force. Coincidentally, the previous instance had also been at the hands of Uehara Shiroa. This combination of old wounds and fresh humiliation created a hatred impossible to forget, truly unforgettable in every sense. If circumstances had been different, if the power gap hadn't been so insurmountable, Sailaporo would have gleefully placed his opponent on a dissection table to examine every aspect of his being. Unfortunately, he had no viable means of confronting this formidable enemy. Previously, Sailaporo had been capable of engaging Uehara Shiroa in direct combat, still qualifying as a worthy opponent. But now, when confronted with the other's overwhelming Ryatsu, he couldn't even maintain his composure, much less mount any form of resistance. Compared to their encounter years ago, Uehara Shiroa's strength had improved exponentially, while his own power had not only failed to increase but had actually diminished. The disparity between them had grown so vast that it transcended dimensions. An insurmountable barrier now separated them, and Shiroa's attack wasn't even specifically targeting him alone. Through specialized surveillance methods, Sailaporo discovered that Uehara Shiroa's attack was remarkably precise yet expansive in range. Almost all the espada had been included within the attack scope, even Aizen, Jin, and Tozen were not exempt. The opponent's attack strength and effective range were beyond comprehension, far exceeding anything Sailaporo could have imagined. This realization deeply troubled the scientist. This definitely transcends the capabilities of any Shinigami or Arrancar. Spatial manipulation abilities can mitigate the problem of Ryatsu attenuation, allowing the spiritual pressure to maintain its terrifying impact over vast distances. But what about the targeting mechanism? How has Uehara Shiroa accurately locked onto so many enemies simultaneously? It's surely impossible for him to encompass the entirety of Hueco Mundo within his perception range, isn't it? There remain too many unsolved mysteries surrounding Uehara Shiroa. For a scientific mind like Sailaporo, this ignorance was nothing short of humiliating. He had always pursued perfection, never allowing himself to remain helpless and ignorant like a common fool. In his relentless pursuit of knowledge, he had even dared to disobey Aizen's direct orders, conducting clandestine experiments when opportunities arose. However, regarding many of Uehara Shiroa's seemingly impossible abilities and methods, Sailaporo had not the slightest clue. He lacked even the conceptual framework to begin understanding them. Of course, his current state was hardly conducive to deep analytical thinking. His spirit body had sustained significant damage, leaving him in an extremely compromised condition. Both his cognitive abilities and combat effectiveness had been severely diminished. Ordinarily, he could have recovered from such injuries by consuming his specially created subordinates. These underlings were essentially living consumables, biological pills designed to restore Ryatsu and physical integrity when absorbed. However, Uehara Shiroa's Ryatsu impact had been so overwhelming that those subordinates had been completely obliterated, leaving not even fragments behind. Therefore, Sailaporo had no choice but to rely on his resurrection to heal his injuries and restore his power. Originally, he wouldn't have needed to resort to his released state to deal with a mere Quincy. He certainly wouldn't have expected to sustain injury. But now, left with no alternatives, he was forced to use his ultimate trump card. Meanwhile, seizing this unexpected opportunity, Ishida Yuryu, whose Ryatsu had been nearly depleted in battle, hastily fled across the desert, desperate to escape while his formidable opponent was momentarily distracted. Chapter 170. Yuryu Ishida had been mere moments away from death. Fortunately, an overwhelmingly powerful Ryatsu had suddenly assaulted Sailaporo, inadvertently saving his life. Without hesitation, Yuryu activated her Renkyaku and fled, intending to restore his depleted Ryatsu and set up strategic traps to assist in the ongoing battle. However, as he attempted to use his Quincy ability, he noticed something deeply troubling. The surrounding Reisher particles had become extraordinarily difficult to control. His previously graceful Herenkyaku felt clumsy and unsteady. His speed and maneuverability had diminished significantly. This was profoundly wrong. Reisher manipulation was a fundamental ability for any Quincy. Excessive Ryatsu consumption might reduce the quantity of Reisher Yuryu could control at once, but it should never affect the quality of his control itself. Something extraordinary must have happened. Could it be related to the massive Ryatsu surge he'd just experienced? As this thought crossed his mind, Yuryu noticed another anomaly. The light surrounding him had grown unusually abundant, as though dawn had broken across the eternal night. But daybreak in Hueco Mundo? That was impossible. This realization prompted him to look skyward, where he beheld an extraordinary sight, a brilliant, miniature sun suspended in the heavens. Golden sunlight and terrifying spiritual pressure poured down like warm, devastating rain upon the white sands. This Ryatsu was beyond comprehension. Gazing at the fantastical scene above, Yuryu adjusted his glasses with a trembling hand, drew a sharp breath, and continued in bewilderment. Could the Shinigami truly possess such overwhelming power? This is nothing short of divine intervention. The erasure particles throughout Hueco Mundo seem to have lost all stability, like frightened children scattering in panic. Such a phenomenon. I believe only Uehara Shiroha could accomplish something of this magnitude. He had known Shiroha was formidable, but never had he imagined power of this scale. Uriya had previously attempted to estimate Shiroha's capabilities, but now those estimates seemed laughably inadequate. How could a mortal presume to gauge the strength of someone who wielded power like a god? His earlier assessments now struck him as nothing more than the naive conjectures of someone both ignorant and fearless. In this moment, Uriya felt profound relief that Uehara Shiroha stood as their ally. The artificial sun hanging in the sky demonstrated that the Espada and all of Hueco Mundo were mere playthings before this man's might. Had such overwhelming power aligned with Aizen's ambitions, it would have spelled certain doom for the world. Uriel had never truly believed the Shinigami held any realistic chance of victory in this conflict until now. Compared to Zamari, Sailaparo could consider himself fortunate. At least Sailaparo possessed the ability to use Resurrection to recover from his injuries. Zamari, however, who had been targeted directly by Uehara Shiroha's attack, found himself in a far more desperate situation. Not long ago, Zamari had grown weary of the cat and mouse game he'd been playing with Rukia Kachiki. He had prepared to crush her with overwhelming force, finally ending their tiresome battle. Then, without warning, he'd felt an icy chill race down his spine, causing cold sweat to erupt across his skin. An utterly terrifying Ryatsu had descended from above with tremendous force, striking him directly. In the instant the spiritual pressure made contact, Zamari reacted with remarkable speed, immediately activating his Resurrection. This decision could not be faulted. His survival instinct had warned him that without releasing his true form, his Ryatsu would prove woefully inadequate to withstand the impact of this heavenly assault. Had he attempted to resist this attack in his unreleased state, he would have been reduced to ash instantaneously. Yet releasing his Resurrection didn't guarantee protection against what felt like divine judgment. In truth, neither the renowned Hierro of an Espada-level Arrancar nor the enhanced Ryatsu following Resurrection offered any meaningful defense against spiritual pressure capable of cutting through space itself. Before such power, these defenses might as well not have existed at all. This thunderous strike, swift as lightning, had torn through Zamari's body and shredded his very soul. Zamari screamed in agony. The Ryatsu he had so proudly unleashed moments ago now scattered like leaves in a gale. Even his released form struggled to maintain stability. His spiritual pressure flickered erratically, like a candle flame threatened by fierce winds. This wasn't due to any weakness on Zamari's part, nor any particular fear of pain. It was simply that this inexplicable attack possessed a level of destructive power beyond anything he had ever experienced or imagined possible. Zamari felt as though his soul had been violently torn in half. The pain defied description. For a spiritual being like an Arrancar, this soul-rending agony was too excruciating, too deadly, too utterly unbearable. Even Sailaparo, who had undergone extensive physical and spiritual modifications, could not endure such torment, much less Zamari. Rukia watched in astonishment as the situation reversed with breathtaking speed. Moments ago, she had teetered on the precipice of death, and suddenly her enemy lay broken and vulnerable. Upon sensing the familiar Ryatsu signature, Rukia immediately understood that Uehara Shiroha had intervened on her behalf. Warmth flooded through her exhausted body, restoring vitality to her depleted form. She managed to summon a fresh stream of Ryatsu from reserves she thought empty. Seizing this unexpected opportunity, Rukia didn't hesitate to strike while the iron was hot. She understood perfectly the principle of exploiting an opponent's moment of weakness. As the seventh Espada with his Resurrection activated,
Zamari should have easily overwhelmed an ordinary Shinigami of vice-captain rank.
But after being struck by Uehara Shiroa's distant attack, he found himself completely drained, fighting Rukia to a stalemate when he should have dominated their encounter.
Now Rukia fought with renewed determination, like a warrior infused with battle fury.
Her eyes blazed with purpose, and her blade gleamed with frost.
She was unleashed.
My teacher is watching me, I will never disappoint him. This singular thought burned brightly in Rukia's mind, powerful and unwavering. Inwardly, Zamari cursed his misfortune.
Damn it all!
Who launched such a devastating attack?
Why was it so impossibly powerful? And why have my abilities suddenly become ineffective?
After weathering the initial impact of the majestic Ryatsu, he managed to steady his thoughts, only to discover that his Amor, the cursed eye ability that allowed him to control his enemies, had inexplicably failed. The unexpected attack had not merely shocked his mind but had torn away pieces of his soul. Part of his spiritual essence had vanished forever.
The Ryatsu from above contained an invisible, intangible, yet terrifying force.
This power could not only shock the mind and sever physical forms, but it could also annihilate the soul itself. With his soul now rendered incomplete, the abilities etched into that soul naturally became unusable. This was the true nature of Uehara Shiroa's Bankai strike, transcending time and space to slash simultaneously through heart, body, and soul. Though Uehara Shiroa had deactivated his Bankai and ceased actively channeling Ryatsu, the golden sun he had created remained suspended in the sky, refusing to dissipate immediately. The impact of his Bankai Shunkyo Reishurisan continued to expand throughout Hueco Mundo. The remaining Espada experienced less severe effects due to their greater distance from the epicenter and because Shiroa hadn't specifically targeted them. Nevertheless, their minds, bodies, and souls endured powerful shockwaves from the attack.
Each Espada felt the reverberations, their eyes widening in shock and disbelief.
The momentary impact had created an unparalleled sense of oppression, more terrifying than even Aizen at the height of his power. They had never experienced such profound, inescapable pressure, a force that penetrated their hearts, tore at their souls, and offered no possibility of resistance or evasion.
Confronted with such overwhelming might, surrender seemed the only rational response.
After the initial fear and shock began to subside, Tyr Harabel's three Frachen reacted with frantic amazement. They gazed upward at the artificial sun hanging in the sky, experiencing the long-forgotten sensation of warmth with profound astonishment. Mila Rose, Sung Sun, and Apache exchanged bewildered comments.
Are my eyes deceiving me? What in the world is that? A sun? In Hueco Mundo?
That wraps up this part of What If Transmigrated in Bleach World.
Thanks so much for listening.
As always, new parts drop every 4 days, so be sure to stay tuned. Also check out my Patreon channel for early releases of all the series, where you can find all the series released one day ahead of YouTube. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, subscribe, share it with your friends, and please consider supporting the original author as well.
See you in the next one.